I would like to move on to Katja Wörmer now. Katja Wörmer is a lawyer specializing in criminal law and family law, and she's the defense lawyer for Reiner Füllmich, and I'm very happy to have you here for the first time. An important point of contact with the speakers here today is, of course, her activity as a defense lawyer of her colleague of lawyer Dr. Reiner Füllmich. He is the founder of the well-known Corona Committee, the group who held hundreds of interviews to record the statements of many critics of the COVID committee. He provided the information long before we got official documents, when the complaints of Reiner showed the difference between the state of law and the deep corona state. He had to be indicted. An attempt was made to turn him into a criminal. What happened in detail and how things panned out, we'll hear from Katja Wörmer under the title Lateral Thinker Lawyer Reiner Füllmich, a Political Trial.
Well, as you kindly announced, I will today report of my colleague Reiner Füllmich, Dr. Reiner Füllmich, who together with 3 other lawyers in spring-summer 2020, when the COVID measures reached their climax, established the Corona Committee. His companions used to be Mrs. Jana Fischer, Dr. Justus Hoffmann and Mrs. Antonia Fischer, all 4 of them lawyers. Originally, there should have been a scientific board to include Professor Hockertz and Professor Homburg. The 2 then did not participate, and this is why Dr. Wolfgang Wodak was involved as a scientific advisor who continues to run the Corona Committee together with Dr. Viviane Fischer. They listened to people affected. They actually invited scientists from all over the world. They actually launched a grand jury proceeding in winter 2022, which is still available on the website. Dr. Reiner Füllmich is not only registered in Germany, but also in the state of California. So he holds an international certification, and he also studied law for a number of years in the US. And this is why he actually wanted to position a class action against the measures, fighting in particular the PCR tests that on a global scale led to what proved to be a test pandemic. At a relatively early stage, he produced a video for this PCR test, which with famous colleagues like Beate Bahner. I'm also a part of the AFA, like Mrs. Bahner. So 130 to 140 lawyers joined forces at the Lawyers for Enlightenment, and we actually represented people affected, whereas many other colleagues actually turned down these inquiries. This is a point that I wanted to mention. Not only my mandate with this client, but I have cared for many, many people affected, represented them legally, also some doctors, like Dr. Fichtner, who's just reported. He was politically persecuted primarily, but most doctors were prosecuted because they issued mask certificates. Yes, I thought so. But as we lately saw, with Dr. Witschel, a physician who was in pre-trial detention for 1 year, Dr. Habig, for instance, who did not do the COVID vaccinations but issued the certificates and was also imprisoned. These doctors are until today treated like terrorists and persecuted. They're detained, like my current client, Dr. Reiner Füllmich, the co-founder of the Corona Committee, was also present there. He himself said that he actually gained 70% of the media exposure because he also led the interviews in English. He invited international scientists, interviewed them, then actually also did the simultaneous interpretation when we did not, but there were not donations available for paying for professional interpreters. And he also initiated and drove the project of the class action, which has not been successful so far. He's always being reproached with not having done anything that he had promised people, things that could not have been kept. This is not true because I know from my own experience that COVID critics and people defending themselves against measures can hardly obtain any legal successes in court. This simply has to do with the fact that such sentences, such judgments are not wanted, they're undesired. With one patient of Dr. Habig, I've been able to achieve an acquittal, but we could sense that there was an appeal directly lodged by the state prosecutor. At times, there are still some unbiased judges, but very rarely so. So much by way of introduction. Dr. Reiner Füllmich, well, as I said, one of the main faces of the Corona Committee in spring 2022 did a 3-month tour, Crimes Against Humanity, in the US. From there, he participated in the multi-hour meetings on Friday afternoons. Dr. Viviane Fischer and Dr. Reiner Füllmich were the faces of the Corona Committee. The other 2 lawyers since mid or spring 21 were no longer that present. Viviane Fischer and Reiner Füllmich primarily handled the meetings, used to be the double top candidates of the Basis party, and also produced a video clip. They also initiated the grand jury, and he actually put together this project of the class action, and they simulated court proceedings for that matter.
Good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you are. This is the 4th session of the grand jury investigation with a real judge, real lawyers, real expert witnesses, and real witnesses outside of the system. The last session dealt with the PCR test and alternative methods of treatment. We will have a brief summary given to us by Judge Rui in a minute, but this is just to inform you that last time we learned that there is no real pandemic, only a PCR test pandemic, and that the virus, which is out there, can be dealt with regular methods of treatment.
The 2 did a lot for national, raising national awareness. I guess there were many of us who actually longed for the Corona Committee meeting, who watched the interviews. My client still receives innumerable letters to his prison thanking him that he had actually saved their lives through the Corona Committee, that he had actually helped them through the horrible times of the lockdowns and the contact limitations and restrictions. Private parties and public parties were very restricted or even prohibited, where the media discouraged to have family parties, family gatherings, where Christmas family parties were limited, and where people affected were indoctrinated that they should no longer meet with unvaccinated people, let alone party with them. In this period, he and the Corona format was a tremendous help to the people affected. To keep things short, in summer 22 there was an internal argument between the individual members of the Corona Committee. Some of you will have heard about it in the alternative media. Viviane Fischer and Dr. Reiner Füllmich actually fought with each other, not in one meeting, but consecutively. It started Viviana on the 2nd of September 22, a Friday, where the meeting was to take place, actually reported to the public about some grievances. And from then onwards, Reiner Füllmich was basically excluded from his own format. And through Roger Bittel TV, he actually defended himself, filed counterclaims. This went on for a while, which was not very helpful for the movement as such. Unfortunately, commercial law or business law matters or inconsistencies were struggled about in public. This was probably an intention, because we assume, it's not my personal contacts, but my colleague, the co-defense counsel, Dr. Christoph Meret, maintains contacts with so-called services and received some pieces of information. Here, again, some persons in the background most probably manipulated and caused and drove this division. This is what happened in the party called Die Basis. This was reported by party members themselves, and this is probably also what happened in the background with the Corona Committee. At the end of the day, the Corona Committee was divided. It was basically destroyed, although Viviane Fischer still runs it with the support of Dr. Wolfgang Wodak, but it no longer has the influence, nor the audience, nor the international impact it used to have. Well, of course, during the pandemic times, and also when the format was still involving the two lawyers. Above and beyond, on the 2nd of September 22, the other two co-founders actually filed a criminal charge against Reiner Füllmich with the Göttingen public prosecutor. Investigation started that the client was unaware of for a long time. There were commercial law inconsistencies. Both Viviane and Reiner Füllmich had taken out private loans from the donation money to secure this money against expropriation, as we saw it happening with the Compact magazine. The whole property in the name of the limited company. And what used to be owned by the LTD, and I guess that the private property of Mr. Elsässer was also seized. As long as these were funds dedicated to the Compact magazine, they were confiscated. In autumn 2020, there were already rumors that the association, the society run by Professor Bhakti, the MWGFD, that you also support, that they had already witnessed such efforts being undertaken by the state. I know that at the AFA, the donation accounts were dissolved externally and the donations returned to the donors. I have postings on social media testifying to this. Professor Hockertz escaped to Switzerland during the pandemic. I do not exactly remember when, because his property was also seized. He was to be put out of action because he fought as an immunologist against the COVID vaccination. So we knew it, rumor had it at that time. And this is why Viviane Fischer and Reiner Füllmich had the idea to secure the high amounts of donations received in the accounts of the Corona Committee. And to do so, they issued loans, and Reiner actually transferred this to his private accounts and used it up privately. He initially had used his very high-priced real estate in Göttingen in a very good district of the city. This is also where he ran his lawyer's office. So he secured this money in real estate. And then from summer, there were internal struggles and controversies. Then the donations were reduced, and they had different ideas about how to use these donations. But when all people involved understand each other, then you pull in the same direction, and such different views can be solved. But if the individual protagonists no longer get along so well, then the courts come in. This is the case when Dr. Fischer and Dr. Reiner Füllmich parted in a controversy, and Reiner Füllmich was demanded to pay back the part of the donation. He wanted to sell his real estate, do so, which failed because we're coming to a field now which does not directly correlate to the movement, but financial matters. At the end of the day, he was able to sell his real estate in autumn 22. The revenue from the sale of the real estate was not remitted to his own account, but to the account of Marcel Templin, with whom he cooperated for the class action. And Reiner Füllmich was no longer able to pay back the loans. In the following period, he made several attempts to regain these funds. The internal struggles and disputes were well liked externally, and finally Reiner Füllmich went to the US and actually spent several months at his ranch in California. But he has owned this since 2017, so he did not escape, or he didn't flee to the US. He also made several interviews from abroad. And then in spring 23, with his wife, he traveled to Mexico, where they visited friends. And then found out after a trip to Peru, where he also made an interview with a priest that they could not return to the US any longer. The Füllmich spouses were sort of concerned, but they were not too concerned because they had experienced trouble with visas before, because they are very strict in the US. Once you're 2 days too late, then you encounter difficulties. This was due to the dogs not getting a clearance. So they stayed in Mexico, and Reiner Füllmich actually managed his lawyer's office in Göttingen. From there, he was by all means accessible. Kanzlei Füllmich continued to exist in Göttingen, in Nikolausberg, the same district as before. He also continued employing a freelancer, a freelance lawyer, and an assistant. This all contradicts an escape and fleeing with donation money. This is what he's reproached with by the Public Prosecutor's Office. A number of lawyers contacted the Public Prosecutor and the police in Göttingen in Germany and asked for an inspection of files in the first half of 23, wanting to know whether there was a search going on for Reiner Füllmich. There were also visits paid to the lawyer's office in Göttingen by the criminal police. But obviously there was no information provided. The 3 lawyers consecutively were not allowed to inspect the files. We know that 2 other lawyers were also co-charged, which makes things easier. A third female lawyer, Dagmar Schön, was not granted inspection of files either, because from the 15th of March 23, there was a national search warrant, and from the 24th of May, there was the European search warrant issued. And then the client stayed in Mexico, no longer returned to Germany, and in early October 23, he was basically tricked out in Mexico. And I can read from the inspection files, the investigators' files, because I don't want to waste too much time. I will not quote this. From the files, we can read that he was tricked into the consulate. He was told in between the couple had actually lost their passports, and they were told that passports had been issued, but that there was signatures missing. But we have correspondence secured between BKA, the German Federal Office of Criminal Offenses, locally working in Mexico City, and they exchanged with the German BKA. So this written correspondence is included in the files, and it shows that they wanted to apply tricks to lure the client into the consulate to detain him and expedite him. They were told there was one signature missing. In the meantime, the couple had found the passports again and said, well, we don't need the new passports anymore. They were told that they had to pick them up, and Reiner Füllmich and his wife actually did comply, as good Germans do, well organized, they comply, and the couple was then detained in Tijuana on the 10th of October by 10 police officers. The wife was not expedited, although she had the same passport status. The wife was able to remain in Mexico. She spent one night in a police cell, but was then allowed to fly back to her residence. Reiner Füllmich was detained, spent one night in prison, and on the 12th or 13th of October, he was air freighted to Frankfurt on Main, and there at the airport he was detained because of the national warrant, police warrant. During the flight, he actually approached the Mexican police officers, and he was told that the flight had been paid for by the German authorities, which is sort of strange. Then on the 14th of October, 13th to 14th October, he was presented to the judge in Frankfurt on Main. This is where I met Reiner Füllmich for the first time personally, and then he was taken to the Rostov prison. This is a high security prison, highly modern, and he's imprisoned there because he comes from Göttingen and has his office there, and also lived there until he left for California and Mexico. Now he's been in pre-trial detention for over 9 months, which is not a lot compared with the Prinz-Reuss group, because they had been in pre-trial prison for over 1 year before a charge was brought before court. The court here is a lot faster. They're putting this under time pressure. On the 17th of November 23, the charge was passed, and the large chamber, commercial chamber, admitted the criminal charge because it was about the commercial cases, and he is actually charged with infidelity, and this is always used as a charge in commercial law when money has not been paid back immediately, or when you assume that a shareholder was not willing to pay back. The court assumes that he was always able to pay back but not willing to pay back, and that at the end of the day he could actually not pay back these amounts because the revenue from the sale never ended up in his account. So these are the details. But the proceedings as such, there are some inconsistencies. Until now, you could say, well, when somebody embezzles donations, this can happen, and this can also be decided by a court. And there are not so many things to be criticized. But the kidnapping in Mexico without a legal basis, then there's the order to expedite. It was not even translated into German, it is still in Spanish, so the court never looked at it, because the court language here is, of course, German, so it should have been translated by a certified translator. So the legal basis on which this kidnapping and expedition was based was never looked at by the German courts. We've seen the 22nd day of proceedings, the large chamber. Since the 3rd of May, so this is for 3 months, has refused a further presentation of evidence. The evidence of the defense counsels are refused. We actually heard 2 witnesses in presence, 2 friends of Reiner Füllmich. They were actually heard in the latest meeting. But apart from that, the presentation of evidence is refused largely. And that since the 3rd of May, we've not heard any witnesses but the proceedings are still ongoing. The court no longer assumes that there were loan contracts. So the actual facts of the case were exchanged. They said that these were bogey contracts, Viviane and Fischer, who actually mutually assigned themselves for the UUG, which only reached the establishment status. But I don't want to comment on the details here. And they mutually assigned each other. And although they were fully fledged lawyers, the court says these were only trustee contracts and no proper contracts. And just by the fact that somebody actually secures the money by buying real estate that first needs to be sold to return the money, actually explains that this is a case of infidelity. It does not look like a neutral proceeding. There was many proposals. Many said that the judges were biased, but this was all refused. And a lot of evidence could not be presented. Dr. Christoph Misery from Cologne, who's also a defense counsel in this proceedings and has contacts with the so-called services, has parts of a dossier. He submitted parts of dossier, and I can actually quote some of the details. I cannot comment on this sufficiently, but I suppose if the colleague has these contacts and has this evidence from a serious source, a dossier which is put together from various documents, describes Reiner Füllmich's past. Before the COVID pandemic, he was not very popular with banks and big groups of companies. He had many scrap real estate cases that he looked after, and he filed criminal charges against banks and big groups of companies. And for years, Reiner Füllmich had no bank accounts or trustee accounts that he received for his office, because he actually filed charges against the Hypo-Bank, Deutsche Bank, etc. for years. And what happened to many doctors during the critical doctors during the pandemic, he was not able to establish bank accounts. All the bank accounts were cancelled or terminated. People affected know that the argument used is always money laundering, and that we know that the protection, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution is quickly involved. The colleague who managed the first bank account for the Corona Committee also had his account cancelled. It was Tobias Weißenborn. His whole family's account was cancelled. Even the older mother had her account cancelled. And the whole family was basically put in clan detention only because he actually managed the Corona Committee's account. The dossier contains all of his activities in the Corona Committee, that he established this committee, that he prepared the international class action, and that he also showed political activities. because he was a member of the Die Basis party and was basically was one of the two top candidates of Die Basis party, and they simulated what would happen if they were elected. Then he was also involved in the diesel scandal a long time before the COVID pandemic. So he's always been a lawyer that has been unpleasant and fighting for the small people. He has always been an enemy of the system of large industry. This dossier says that a construction of offenses was to be made to prevent eligibility into political office. So I am already reminded of the time, and well, when you're a lawyer in criminal law, and then you often forget about time. So this is the status quo. We think that the court wants to pass a sentence, and they always speak about a severe imprisonment. We do hope that we can actually avert this way, one way or the other, but there are very clear signs. Oh yeah, let me say something about the detention conditions. This is the most striking thing to note. My client has been in Roosdorf in solitary confinement for several weeks now. The prison management said that this was not the case. It was just an isolation, but he's the so-called Auffangstation with higher security conditions, no contact with any other co-prisoners. He provided legal services. Well, as a lawyer, of course, you're always active, and then, of course, help other prisoners and give them tips and tricks how they can defend themselves legally. So this was strongly disliked. This was classified as incitement. So he's only allowed to make a telephone call with me when the other prisoners are not in a public space. And he now has different telephone times. He actually makes telephone calls at 5, and he has to call me at 30 past 4, and he's only allowed to leave his cell for an hour in pre-trial detention. He was only allowed to do so alone, and for a few days he has even been forbidden to do this at all because they were afraid that he could actually establish contact through windows with other prisoners. And for the main trial days in the Göttingen court, he not only has to appear shackled with shackled hands, treated as if he was severely dangerous, he even obtains shackles on his feet, and the transport is accompanied by several patrol cars, and for each transport he has to sign that he does not want to wear an armored vest because there could have been an attempt to liberate him, and the police men accompanying him wear such vests, and they are actually equipped with machine guns. And all visitors are, of course, screened like at the airport. It reminds me of having a terrorist as a client, a ref, a terrorist, but not a lawyer who does not have a criminal record whatsoever.